Hello, everyone. Welcome to XenTegra IGEL Weekly. We're on episode 51 this week. Thank you for joining. I'm joined this week by Chris Feeney from IGEL. Chris, how you doing?
Doing well, man. Thanks. I'm sorry I missed the last few. Just things have picked up travel-wise, and my schedule's been kind of nutty on our normal Tuesday when we record this. So I'm glad to be back. I cannot believe we've crossed 50 already. We're at 51. That's pretty cool, man.
Yeah, we were saying last week, when we get to 100, we're going to do fireworks from Seb's house. So we'll do some German fireworks. That's how we're going to kick it off. I failed to introduce myself. My name is Patrick Toner. I'm filling in for Andy this week. Andy and Seb, neither of them could join us this week. So Chris and I are going to kind of be just talking through a cool new feature with IGEL. Chris, it's good to see you survived the monsoon down there. You guys got some bad weather.
Yeah, we did. It was, I know there's others that are probably dealing with worse, but we had a slew of storms. One came by in the afternoon, pretty bad. My phone's lighting up with power outages stuff. We didn't lose power, but we lost, for crying out loud, we lost the internet for hours. So
how did you survive?
I don't know how I survived. Honestly, I almost forgot all those, life-saving skills that you learned early on in life. And it's hard to believe how crippled you can be without the internet. So hot spots it was, and choppy bars on my phone, but we got through it. We survived.
I wonder, like those escape room things, if you put a bunch of IT guys into different rooms and said, here, do your job, and took their internet away, I don't know that we'd be able to do it. I mean,
I can tell you this, for the last 15 plus years, I've been, getting close to 20 now, hard to believe. I couldn't do my remote job without the internet. For me, as a remote employee for the last decade plus, thank goodness we had WebEx back in the day. That was really the tool that I began to use early on to, connect remotely and, do all that stuff. I mean, obviously a lot's come along since then. But I mean, without internet, broadband, I mean, a lot of us would be doing the commuting thing, going into work, that type of thing. So, yeah, when it's down, it's where's the nearest Panera, generally if I want high speed. So,
I mean, even for tasks though, right? Like obviously we couldn't function with getting on a Zoom call, things like that, but even a lot of the tasks we do, right? Like if I can't look at my notes, which are in the cloud, and be able to Google search things, I'm kind of rendered useless at that point. And I would say that's probably most people in the technology field. Some things I retain, but if I don't have my notes, it's not like I don't keep any paper and pen anymore. It's all in the cloud.
yeah, it does beg the question, because I remember when my first job at college, I got my first computer at work, and I had gone through college using a day timer, and that literally saved my life. I mean, it saved me from becoming just completely useless in college. I was very disciplined in time management, and that, just making sure I knew when was going on, but I didn't have a computer, didn't have a phone, none of that stuff. It was just that thing, and that really kept me going. I got away from that when I got my first computer and the Palm Pilot began to emerge. And when I had enough money, I went and said, I'm going to try that thing. It looks really cool. And, kind of get away from what was working and thinking technology would be that thing. But even those early years, you were syncing. And then when you got back, you did it offline and you'd sync back because there was no wireless like it is today, or broadband or any of that stuff. So it does make me think, like, obviously there's tremendous, I mean, if Azure goes down, right? I mean, there's plenty of like options to still get in there, right? If that's where your stuff might reside, versus one single data center or two data centers. But anyways, yes. If you don't have internet, how can, what are your options? Offline mode kind of thing.
Well, I think we may have unintentionally segued into our article today, talking about the importance of where your data lives and how you access it.
That was completely unplanned, but
that was unplanned. unplanned.
Just kind of circled right around to this topic of great import, I should say.
Exactly. One bad joke leads to a segue. It's good. And I just want to throw a public, because I noticed myself in the camera here. I'm drinking out of a red Solo cup. I just want to make a public service announcement that it is coffee. It's iced coffee. All of my, there you go.
Mine
It's
is a
not,
British mug. It's coffee, not tea.
there you
Cheers.
go. Cheers. I just wanted to just make it clear. All of my glasses and belongings are basically packed away right now.
I know you're a closet Toby Keith fan.
Yeah. I'm not like Meredith from the Office. I just want to make that clear. So
It's coffee
right,
in a
cool.
red Solo cup. I hope it's iced coffee.
Yeah, I haven't drinking out of a red Solo cup at 9 in since I was like 23 probably.
That's right. Is it clean? Who cares?
Yeah, I think it was clean. I think so. This is our fine china right now as we pack away our lives into a pod. So
that's right. When is the big move down to Florida?
Yeah, big move comes up. We have to be out of our house tomorrow. So we're moving out of our house tomorrow. We have a rental in the interim. Our house down in Florida should be ready. They're saying like beginning of July now. So we'll see how it goes. Hope the end of June is still possible, but we'll see, man. I'm hoping it just kind of gets here quick, sooner rather than later, so I can get this thing unloaded and get the move behind me. Just tired of moving. Anyway. All right. So I'm going to share out my screen here. We're going to talk about a new feature that's come out recently in UMS. So Chris brought this to my attention, and I actually was not aware of it until we were just chatting right before the podcast. So, traditionally, Chris, and correct me here if I'm wrong, IGEL always had two main ways customers install UMS. One is a standalone UMS, which uses an embedded database. The embedded database is, of course, Apache Derby. Really solid. There's customers doing that in production. And then, of course, you have your enterprise type customers or customers who maybe they're not a large enterprise, but they have a requirement for high availability. So IGEL had an HA mode where you would have to use an external database, something like a SQL or an Oracle. And then you can have multiple UMS servers with a token trust connecting to this SQL database. But now we have another option here called Distributed UMS. And Chris, I'll just let you kind of explain it. You were describing it to me, but let's talk through it as we have it up here on the screen. What is Distributed UMS, and why might a customer consider this instead of HA if that's a requirement for them?
Well, I think it's a couple things. It simplifies, but also provides the same functionality as what we had with an HA. The other pieces to the HA component, along with a little bit more complexity to getting it up and running, were additional ports that were required for incoming to the UMS server, right? Plus load balancers, a variety of things, and this is all covered in our IGEL Certified Architect course. But the distributed UMS feature was not in there because we just literally came out with it in UMS version 6.10. I think the nice thing here is that it's just a simple, when you install UMS for the first time and you want to take advantage of this feature, obviously you need to have a a external database that we talked about earlier. But you would just check a box, and it also simplifies, well, what ports are needed to be open to communicate with UMS and that type of thing. It just sort of simplifies it, but it allows for something like, all right, I'm going to have my database in, let's say, a data center in the central United States. My UMS server, let's assume I'm going to do it in a cloud environment. I'll put that in the east, and I'll set it up. It'll connect in, and it'll communicate back to that database. Let's assume that the back end of these databases the back end communication is a gigabit easily, maybe more. And then you want to set up a second one somewhere else and point at the same database. Might have it a physical separate data center. It allows you to kind of share that database, and a lot of the messaging between what was normally done through the HA functionality, a lot of that is now happening inside of the database itself in the distributed UMS mode. So there's a lot to kind of dig through here. I am just getting used to it myself because it is it's fairly new. But I think it's kind of setting the stage for what we had talked about, probably some time ago, putting UMS databases in a cloud environment, Azure, AWS, for example. This is kind of really moving in that direction where you are leveraging those environments, but you only require like one port or something like that to actually communicate into it. And that could be through an ICG, obviously, talking to a UMS.
So yeah, I mean, I'm looking at this, reading through it. The one thing that sticks out to me is cross subnet communication for the cloud environments like Azure, AWS are possible. Before with HA, it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Chris, that you would always want, let's say you had two UMS servers and you had a SQL database, you would want them in the same data center. Is that accurate? That with traditional IGEL high availability?
Yes, in fact, a little further down, if you scroll a little bit further down just below, you'll notice under the characteristic features, actually go up a little bit more. Under the HA, this load balancers, UMS servers, load balancers must reside on the same VLAN. And there's no support for cloud environments like Azure and AWS. That is now possible with the UMS distributed UMS feature, excuse me. So I think it's kind of heading in that direction that we were talking about earlier, and then just chit-chatting about things being in the cloud. But I know that there was, customer demand for this type of thing, and obviously it simplifies things greatly because you don't have to worry about additional servers or features like the UMS load balancing capability. Anyway, so this is just, like I said, it's brand new. I don't know how many people are actually using it yet, but it's definitely something to be considered as you are either spinning up a brand new environment or maybe preparing for something where they could expand even further and just take advantage of this new feature.
Well, and you mentioned something else there, which is crucial, right? Supportability, right? So if you're a customer who's in the cloud, and I'm working with customers quite a bit like that, who they have a charter like, hey, listen, any new servers, they're not going in our data center. So it either needs to be SaaS or it needs to be hosted in Azure or AWS. So, if there's an IGEL customer or potential IGEL customer where, that's something that their boss has said to them, hey, listen, any net new servers have to be in the cloud. This is huge, right? Now you have a fully supported way of doing basically a high availability option for your UMS solution.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think it just simplifies it, right? As far as the load balancing piece, DNS round robining, is that really a word? DNS round robin would be, that's right, we don't edit on this podcast. We just kind of plow right through.
I would have never called you on that one. I'd probably use that same round robin.
It sounds like a 50s song, doo-wop, whatever. But yeah, DNS round robin load balancing would be used in this distributed UMS feature. And some of those folks may already out there using it, but that's really what we're looking at here. So,
but yeah, and I'm gonna pull up to your point. Just for a visual of how the traditional model would work with load balancers and HA. It was a little complicated, and so if I did, let's see here. I think if I go to, where is this? I'm just going to search diagram. There you go. UMS installation diagrams and types. So if I did here, so here now we have HA or distributed. So that's kind of cool here.
Yeah, so that's nice that they updated it. And just so you know, since we're recording video, if you get to the knowledge base, look in the upper right corner and you'll see, like next to English, 6.10 latest. So make sure you're not pointing at some link that is not the latest. If you click that drop down up in the upper right corner, you'll notice. And so that's where this page will get refreshed. I'm actually adding in a link to the chat where we can go and how does actually distributed feature get installed. But But yeah, you can see here the complexity involved when doing the HA method. And then, and now we've got the distributed option. So, so which one is this? This is large environment.
This is a large HA that includes an ICG. So you can kind of remove, if you look at the bottom right quadrant here, for anyone listening, basically, just to keep it simple, in the traditional model, you have multiple servers. You have each load balancer has to be its own server, correct, Chris?
Yes.
And so you have, up here, you're gonna have two servers that are running your your HA UMS servers, and then you're gonna have two servers that are just used as load balancers. So you're right away, and basically the minimum requirements for these for each of these servers is 4 CPUs. Really, I mean, this is 6 gigs plus 7. I would say it's probably more like 12 gigs per server. So 4 CPUs, 12 gigs, maybe 100 gigs of it's only need 25 gigs of hard drive space, but you're saving quite a bit of resources just cutting out 2 of those servers. I mean, that's actually pretty substantial, especially when you're talking about cloud, right? Where you're paying monthly for each instance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could probably run a calculator. I know I've seen on at portal.azure.com, you can kind of run through a calculation and then come out with a cost estimate. And you could do that with the traditional HA option and then do it again with the distributed and see what's reduced there. So so yeah, so now you could have 2 UMS servers. Let's say you want to put the web app on each of those. So let's say that's 12 gigs of RAM. There is no HA feature turned on. And so we just kind of go through and select that and start off with one server, and then you could add a second one, point at the same database. And now you've got 2 UMS servers using the same database, communicating together, serving your customers. So,
another thing. Go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry.
I'd say if you want to, at some point, we can transition to how does it actually get installed. There's an article that walks through how the distributed UMS server is installed. But
yeah, well, real quick, let me mention one other thing, and then we'll hop into that. You kind of mentioned the ports, but I mean, this is another thing. In the distributed mode, you only need 8443 for basically your files to be pushed down. But traditionally under HA, each server needed all these crazy ports open, 6155, 61,616. So you had to open up additional ports. I mean, it's less steps when you're an admin and you have to go to InfoSec and say, hey, I need all these ports opened. And then they're going to scrutinize you for every single one of them. It's one less step for the admin to say, hey, I'm going to throw IGEL in HA mode in this new distributed mode. I don't need this traditional mode and have all these other ports that I need open. I think that's
a great point. Especially, let's say we're not using a cloud. Let's say we're just using traditional database. Data centers. It's still less ports. I remember on the Fed side when I was covering there, they had servers on strict VLANs, and we had to get the firewall folks to open up so we could communicate. Thankfully, it wasn't a ton to open up, but we made sure that the typical ones were there. But this is kind of simplifying that, recognizing that less is more, if that's a good way to put it. But what we've got on the screen now is sort of how this feature is actually installed. So let's assume we have a brand new server we're going to spin up and install UMS on it. You'll notice that part of the installer option is going to include this new distributed feature. So you've got, let's see here, install the UMS server, blah, 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 whether Windows or Linux, select the standard UMS with either embedded or external database. So yeah, you can see the drop-down menu there.
Yeah, see the drop down. So it looks like you can start it with either one. You can pick embedded, you can pick external, but then step 2, you're going to configure an external. So you can kind of switch it later on. But obviously, So basically, this
Yeah,
is if you want to install the step one first, you could have the database set up first and just select external and then connect to it.
yeah, it's like which one's a chicken or the egg kind of thing.
Right.
So it actually simplifies it. I mean, my preference would be start with the embedded and then just switch over but it doesn't have to be that way. And then you can see here in the console, there's a checkbox to enable it's under UMS administration global config server network settings, activate the distributed UMS, which would mean you would have to be pointing at the external database at that point. So, and then you just restart the server service, which can be done through the administrator console. You'll see that distributed UMS feature there as well. And certainly a reboot of the machine that's also doable, but that's really what it takes, not much. So fairly cool feature. I don't know, we have IGEL Disrupt going on right now in various cities around the world. Technically speaking, we've got 2 going on just today alone, Europe and here in Pittsburgh. I don't know if this is being talked about because I haven't seen the actual agenda, but I would imagine it might be. But yeah, I think it's a very cool feature. Certainly, I would expect. I need to check with our IGEL Academy team if we're going to add a little chapter to this new component at some point. But yeah, very cool that we've got this now.
Yeah, very good. I think, as I'm thinking through this, I mean, I can't think of any scenario really where somebody would want to do the traditional HA now that this is an option. I mean, can you think of any, is there a scenario still where the traditional model is still a fit? Like doing the old school HA versus this distributed UMS?
I mean, it's hard to think why more complexity would be involved. I mean, I think if you probably yes, but pulling back to 10,000 feet, we've got UMS 12 being developed now. There's an early access program testing things out before we actually put it out for real. A lot of that is, I think, taking some of these features that were introduced in UMS 10. Why would you not build for the cloud? Why would you not build for something like that, where that would be the standard, where we're not building data centers? We want to use the cloud and we don't want to require a bunch of complexity with that. And so I would imagine that going forward, you would probably see customers begin transitioning to this simpler functionality, and it has all the functionality. It's just less complex.
Yeah, and I can't think of a single admin who's going to look at those 2 options and go, okay, I have one more complicated, and I have one that's going to make my life a little easier. I mean, at the end of the day, we're kind of lazy people in the admin world, right? And so I can't think of a single person who would just go, yeah, I'm going to go with more complex.
I think about this. I love my friend Ron Nair. He's not, I wouldn't call him lazy by any means. The guy crushes things off the list, but if he can find a way to simplify and get the same thing done, but maybe take it from 10 steps down to 1 or 2, and it gets the same result, I mean, why not? So
Why not?
but I think, it's nice. I guess I don't know how much how much press this new feature has received. Part of that is just because I'm a little behind on traveling, but I've seen the chatter internally, and I was like, what, it's probably time to talk about this. So disclaimer, forgot that to mention early on that definitely not a Johnny rocket scientist on this new feature. So there might have been things that we said, hopefully not, that are actually incorrect, but I think we've tried to make sure that we've kind of covered the bases here. But if you hear this podcast and you have actually tested this feature out or whatever, comments certainly would be welcome, feedback. But I think from my perspective, it seems like it gets the job done without the less complexity of an HA scenario. So
Yeah, don't even worry about it, Chris. Our editors will take it right out.
that's right. Yeah,
If they
just
existed.
like that round robining thing.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, nothing. So we can just make the disclaimer. Everything on here is 100% accurate or your money back.
Right.
No doubt. But yeah, so, you mentioned
Right.
IGEL Disrupt earlier, Chris. I know that they're ongoing. You've been to a couple of them.
Actually, I'm not. That's
Oh,
my
you
other
haven't?
disclaimer. I have, well, it's just the way it's worked out. I have not been to one yet. I think I'm going to probably go to one here in about a week or so. But we've had one because it fell like with Memorial Day. There was supposed to be one, I think, in Nashville this week, but they've postponed that to the fall, just the way things were working out schedule wise. But there's multiple cities, as you can see here in Europe as well as North America. So we've got Pittsburgh this week. It's actually happening today, next week, and two next week, actually, one out west in Newport Beach, California. That's actually going to be a really nice location. We did one there last year as well. And then down in Florida, Tampa, where heck, you might even be down there by then. So yeah, when are you moving down to Florida?
So I will not. I'm going to miss. I won't be in Florida till the 18th is when we actually take our trek to Florida. We have a rental up here.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, June. I got you. Okay, no worries.
I will
So you
say,
can
for anybody listening, for Tampa, we are hosting a happy hour for our customers. So as an XenTegra happy hour, probably for some of these other locations. I just know Tampa just because I work with a lot of the Florida customers. But yeah, so if you're in the Florida area and you're hearing this and we're going to IGEL Disrupt in Tampa, June 9th, reach out. We'd love to have you.
Yeah, it'll be. I'm looking at a lot of good content there. You'll probably hear more about some new things. There's stuff that I'm working on right now that I am not at will to share, but I can tell you this: I'm very excited about some things that we're working on that we'll be able to talk about, hopefully in the next few months, but we'll see. But stay tuned, folks.
Awesome. And Chris, I don't know, is there a release date for OS 12? Has that been announced?
I don't have a specific date yet. I think a general range. I've heard September, but that might get pushed. A lot of it is based on how things are going in the current testing process now. My general impression is the web app, which is really the kind of the key thing. They've been focusing on adding more functionality to that, like they have had in the Java console for years and years. It looks, I mean, if you've seen the web app in OS 11, UMS 6, for example, it looks generally the same. It's not going to be a complete, overhaul and learning experience. So, but they've definitely added some more functionality there. So I think you're going to start seeing more and more where that's the way things will be in the future. I think September is sort of that plan, but I could push.
Cool. Very good. And, I don't know how much of OS 12, so for anyone considering going to Disrupt, and first of all, Disrupt is a great conference, not just for IGEL, but it's really an end user compute conference. So you're going to have tons of different vendors there. Everybody that kind of lives in that VDI desktop as a service space, right? All the big players, everybody from Citrix, VMware, the Liquidwares, Login VSI, Control Up, all these guys, with a presence. But from an IGEL side, Chris, how much of I know you guys are talking about OS 12. What is actually, what can people expect from IGEL based on kind of what you guys are putting out there publicly, and how much of it can you not talk about, I guess?
So I think the general concepts I can speak to, right? So UMS, the new version, will be called 12. And so will the OS version. So the numbering will become the same. And that's not uncommon in today's vendor world. UMS 12 will be able to work with version 12 as well as version 11 of the operating system. So you'll be able to have both And obviously there'll be a migration path, upgrade path from one to the next. Probably the biggest thing is subscription licensing will be part of OS 12 and 11. So, or I'm sorry, 12. I'm getting all my numbers mixed up here, but and there'll be bundles, right? Things are going on right now in terms of getting the price book updated and new SKUs created, all that stuff. So you can expect that to be part of it. Probably the bigger thing though is today's IGEL OS has everything baked in. When we release a firmware update, it'll include various fixes or new versioning of stuff. Maybe it's Citrix, Zoom client, maybe it's VM, whatever it might be, browser updates. Going forward, that's no longer the situation. You'll have the operating system and some of the key components that are there, but apps are going to be separated out into what's called a portal, where you will then, the UMS will connect to the portal, and this could be a public portal. So you could have obviously the stuff that is approved to be in the UMS, in the app portal. So somebody submits, let's take Zoom, for example. Let's say the Zoom Linux client, Zoom is managing that and they're updating that, and then they submit that to IGEL to be put into the public portal, where somebody that manages IGEL and the environment say, oh, there's a new Zoom update. I'm going to go ahead and once I see it, I can pull it down and making sure that, I then push it out just like I would an update. So obviously firmware updates are now just going to be literally, I guess the equivalent would be your phone. You have a mobile operating system, for example, that might get an update, and sometimes, generally speaking, would often require a reboot. If you don't need a OS update, just the apps, then generally speaking, the apps very often won't require a reboot. So if you think about that, how much downtime do you have that you can afford, right? Today, anytime you update operating system for IGEL, you got to reboot. No questions asked. It just has to happen. That will no longer necessarily always be the case. There'll be some situations where, hey, we got to, there's a kernel update to support X, Y, or Z, or security update that's required, whatever it might be. But I would say fewer and further between on the reboots. Then you take the apps and imagine being able to just update the app without a reboot on the machine. That's, not an uncommon architecture. We're used to that today with the phones and the mobile apps and that type of thing. So that's probably the bigger thing. And then, of course, there'll be a concept where maybe you have like a private app portal. So maybe there's certain apps that your company is using that's not publicly available, whatever. There's that piece. And so your UMS can connect to that one as well. I don't have the details on that, but the long and short of it is the apps will be separated out, and then you'll just manage them through UMS to push them down. Still be centrally managed, that type of thing, but the IGEL OS will be less in terms of the size, and then you bring your apps on it. So that's probably the bigger thing. So those are the pieces that are being worked out now, and tested out through various things. Plus, there's a bunch of other features, the onboarding experience. Instead of today, if you install IGEL, you get fill in the blank kind of thing. If you're remote and you want to fill in that registration thing, you say this will connect to ICG. Now it'll just be, if you're doing it manually, you'd be probably say what's your language, what's your time zone, what's your email address, or connect to the wireless, right? Connect to your internet, whatever, and then what's your email address, and that's it. Once you connect in, it'll register, start configuring the device, license the machine, and then putting the configuration on there. So it's a greatly simplified onboarding experience, a much more modern interface, I would say, for that. And of course, if the device is on the same network, it'll just pop up like today, register automatically. You won't have to worry about that. But if you're remote, and a lot of us are these days, and you get a brand, let's say you say, hey, we're going to ship a laptop to you. It shows up from, it's a Lenovo or LG or something, Dynabook, whatever. It's got OS 12 on it. Those things are all you need, and you're good to go. You might have a Azure Virtual Desktop in front of you in 2 minutes.
Yeah, and you said something there I never considered, which I always thought of OS 12 more like it's going to be a lighter operating system and you'll just have more flexibility with the apps, which is true, of course. But, I never considered the fact that you wouldn't have to reboot the OS. I mean, that is a big deal, right? If you're doing an update, for example, just to get the newest Citrix Workspace app, you no longer need that update, which today you do. You have, when you do that firmware update, it's gonna reboot 100% of the time. Now it's, hey, push the Citrix Workspace app down to all of you might have thousands of devices in your environment. You can kind of do it silently at a certain time, and there's really virtually no downtime there. It's huge.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting because I was in a meeting a few weeks back with a vendor that I've known for a long time, and the way that with SaaS-based architecture, new features. I mean, today, like I use Office.com, everybody does, right? Behind the scenes, Microsoft might introduce a new feature, and upper right corner, they may say, "Hey, check out this new feature. Are you interested in trying it?" And I didn't see a prompt, "Hey, we got to reinstall Outlook." It just sort of is behind the scenes. Things are happening. Maybe it's Teams, whatever. And but they're pushing out these new features and stuff. And if they can do it without the user experience suffering or any kind of reboot occurring, it's just seamless. And so one of the challenges that customers or some of these vendors have faced in today's architecture is they often require a reboot to get their new stuff installed. And to have a self-updating kind of architecture with an app, or the ability to do that without rebooting and then take advantage of new features, functionality, security, whatever it might be, it certainly resonates quite well, especially in certain industries, manufacturing, healthcare. I'm sure there's others, whatever, but we're very little downtime is acceptable, or I'm sorry, or you prefer to have very little downtime.
Right. Desirable.
Desirable. That's right. It must be this British coffee mug.
It is. You gotta switch it up. I think it's the British coffee.
American coffee.
All American.
American.
Well, listen, man. I know we're kind of coming up against time here, but no, it's just great stuff. I mean, it's kind of cool to see, IGEL moving really all of the focus more to a cloud. I mean, even the distributed UMS feature we're talking about today, the focus is on cloud. OS 12, more of a cloud-based solution. Obviously, everybody's moving that way, and it's cool to see the innovation there. But I think just a couple things to plug real quick before we end here. To anyone who's listening, we have a lot of events coming up, and you can always find them at XenTegra.com. We have workshops. Chris and I actually do a monthly IGEL workshop where we'll do different technology vendors that integrate into that workshop. So, we do a lot of things, other than IGEL at XenTegra, things like Nutanix, Citrix, Microsoft, Azure Virtual Desktop, VMware. We have a lot of great resources. We have podcasts on all of these platforms, as well as workshops, boot camps, webinars. You can find all of that at XenTegra.com. And of course, we mentioned IGEL Disrupt. Hopefully we'll see you out at some of these events. If you guys are there, please say hello. You can find that at DisruptEUC.com. All the different locations, both in North America and in Europe. I doubt we have many European. Well, I don't know. With Seb, we might have some European listeners. Who knows?
If you scroll up, you'll see it's DisruptEUC.com/ontour 2022, and there's quite a bit of locations. So today, I think they're in Cologne, Germany. That's where Seb is, so he would be here with us today. But they've had in the last few days, week or so, similar to the American tour. But it's been well received. I think as each of these has happened, we've had bigger crowds show up. I think they had like 200 people in London alone. And I think, I don't know about you, but I've gone to the airport a few times, and I remember the last few trips, parking was crazy. I mean, people are ready to get out there. They're out there. And I think, especially with mask mandates kind of being lifted in some respects, people are out and busy traveling. So I think we've with these events, the timing has been really good because people are coming. I was at one last week in Tampa. I think they had maybe 1,500 people show up, and we were at a vendor row where people came and checked out things. And of course, our biggest thing is, this is the one thing that brings them all to the table, right? The the Zippy the Hedgehog. And instead of just handing them out, we were raffling them off. And believe me, people were like, "Oh, that looks like, can I have one? I need your email address."
This is a true story. When I used to cover the New York area for IGEL,
Yeah.
we would go to all the different trade shows up there, and we had people come up to us. It was one person specifically would always find us. I don't even know if they knew what we did, but they would always try to get one of those hedgehogs for their dogs. I'm pretty convinced they just thought we made stuffed animals for a living. That's what IGEL was. But yeah, they're a very popular item at the trade shows, no doubt.
Yeah, we've got another one that's a little bigger now. It's for golf, like put on your golf club, your driver.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, that one is definitely it's a collector's item, rare find, but I've got one for one of our next events we're coming up here with soon. But needless to say, Hedgehog power is out there, and people are excited about it. So love to see you at one of these events or the XenTegra events. I know XenTegra's got a nice big party coming up here, 10-year anniversary coming up here in June, I think.
Yeah,
so,
man.
That'll be exciting. Hopefully we can chat more about that when Andy is available to join us once again. So
absolutely. Yeah. And you can always find, that and more at XenTegra.com. I think it's /events. I should probably know that.
Somebody's going to win a Ford Bronco. I think you got finalists maybe, and then that's the big reveal. Is that correct?
That is correct. We're raffling off the Ford Bronco, and then we're actually doing another one next year. We're already opening up enrollment on that. So if you like the Bronco, attend our webinars, workshops, enter, and have a chance to win one. Can't win if you don't enter. So
nice.
Yeah. So anyway, you can find this and more at XenTegra.com/events. Chris, always a pleasure, man. Always good to talk to you. Thanks for the update on this feature. I think a lot of people are going to be finding that to be useful. And yeah, man, we'll sync up on the next one.
All right. Have a good one.
Take care. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.